Hello, you guys. Today we are going to be talking about a very serious topic. We're going to be talking about genocide in the 20th century. Um, so today, some of the things we may talk about today are going to be pretty upsetting. It's a very heavy subject. I want to say off the bat here that if you are having trouble with anything that we're talking about today, or if you have further questions that you want to ask me, please do not hesitate to reach out and ask. My preference would be if we could do this lecture in person so that we could kind of have this experience together, but that's not how things are working out this year. So I guess without further ado, let's start talking. So genocide means one of the following acts committed with the intention of destroying a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. This is according to the definition of genocide from the UN Convention of 1948 following the Second World War. And this is actually the first time that genocide is used, or the term genocide is used. So genocide can mean killing the members of the group, causing them severe mental or physical damage, deliberately inflicting conditions of life that would destroy that group, preventing births through use of involuntary sterilization, forced abortion, prohibition of marriage, or separation of the sexes intended to prevent procreation. And it can also mean forcibly transferring the children of one group to another, so raising them in another tradition or culture so that they do not know their cultural heritage. This definition of genocide comes in 1948 with the Nuremberg trials that follow World War II, and it is applied first to the Holocaust. But the first event in the 20th century that can really earn the term genocide is actually much earlier than the Holocaust, and we're going to talk about that one first. And that is the Armenian genocide that happens during World War I. So the Armenian genocide takes place in the Ottoman Empire during World War I. So we are going back in time a little bit from when we've been discussing in the last few days. Armenians are a cultural group from the region east of Turkey and Anatolia. During the Ottoman Empire, Armenians were a minority within the empire, and they were majority Christians. They had their own separate language. Many Armenians were tradespeople. Some Armenians lived in, separate villages, as we discussed when we talked about the Ottoman Empire and their treatment of Christians. Others were mixed in with Ottoman populations. Throughout Ottoman history, they had traditionally been discriminated against and sometimes even persecuted. And they were definitely seen as other and separate from the Turkish population that was the majority of the Ottoman Empire. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, and this continues throughout the 1800s. In 1911 and 1913, the Ottoman Sultan was involved in a series of wars in the Balkans and loses a great deal of territory. So, that's part of the lead up to World War I was the Ottoman Empire had previously occupied that territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina. which the Austrian-Hungary Empire had seized. So, we saw the consequences of Austria-Hungary seizing that for Europe. For the Ottoman Empire, losing that territory also had its own consequences, because it sort of destabilized the empire and caused a lot of unrest and dissatisfaction. In 1913, there was a coup d'etat by a group called the Young Turks, who basically overthrew the Ottoman Emperor and seized power. This new sort of political ruling party had a military background, and they were in favor of extreme nationalist policies and politics. And that was bad news for anybody who wasn't Turkish. The Young Turks had a vision of the Ottoman Empire as, this uniquely Turkish and Muslim empire, which meant that they were going to be targeting people like the Armenians. In 1914, World War I starts, and the Ottomans join into the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. And the war, particularly between the Ottomans and Russia, is relevant to this genocide because many Ottomans saw Armenians as allied with Russia because they were both Orthodox Christians, and at various points in time, Armenia, that territory, had Russian influences. And so there was a lot of suspicion put on the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire that they may help the Russians and turn against the Ottomans. So the Ottomans did not do well in World War I. The Turks suffered a lot of really large losses, specifically against the Russians in the Caucasus Mountains. And during this period, some Armenians also do take service in the Russian army and join the Russian army fighting against the Ottomans. Meanwhile, the Ottomans are also facing pressure from British troops fighting the Turks at sea. And so the war is not going well. And the Armenians are seen as this other group that is a threat to the Ottomans. This comes to a head on April 24th of 1915, which is the date that the Armenian Genocide begins. On that date, the Turkish Minister of Internal Affairs orders the arrest and deportation of over 250 Armenian intellectuals, most of whom are murdered, or who never are able to return to their homeland. Following this, the Turkish government uses the excuse that Armenians were siding with the Russians, and that targeting Armenians was part of fighting World War I. But in reality, this was an attempt at extermination. They were specifically targeting civilian populations with the intent of wiping out this group of people. So starting in the spring of 1915 and for several years after, the Armenian Genocide continues. Armenian men are executed, while Armenian mothers and children were forced out to walk out into the Syrian desert on what are called death marches. They had no food or water. They were trying to carry all of their belongings with them. Due to the lack of basic facilities, most of them perish within days or weeks. There are sort of refugee camps out in the desert that are completely unsupplied in any way. We can see in the picture above one of these marches with Ottoman soldiers with guns, sort of forcing the Armenians to march out into the desert. Also at this time, many Armenian children are forcibly separated from their families, specifically infants and toddlers are separated from their families and given to Turkish families, who would raise them to speak Turkish and to follow Islam, basically erasing their culture. In total, the death toll from this genocide is 800,000 to 1.5 million. This was approximately half the population of Armenia in the Ottoman Empire. The rest of the world was not blind to what was going on in the Ottoman Empire at this time. There were missionaries in the Ottoman Empire who were sending word out, and these reports of what was going on were reported in newspapers around the world, including the New York Times. However, World War I was still being fought, and so there wasn't really much that the international community could do about this at the time. After the war was over, the genocide basically ended when the war ended. And at that point, there was so much else going on and so much other reconstruction that needed to happen that nothing much was really done to address the genocide. So in 1918, the Ottoman Empire loses World War I. The three leading figures from the Young Turk government were trialed by the Allies and sentenced to death in absentia. Starting in 1923, we have a new regime coming to power in Turkey. The Ottoman Empire basically falls, and we have Turkey taking its place. This new leader of Turkey was a war hero, an Ottoman war hero from World War I, and he also was intensely, pro-Turk. Under his leadership, the Turkish government denies that what happened to the Ottomans was a genocide, and they continue with this denial to this day. This has been a significant source of conflict between Armenia and the Ottoman Empire, and Turkey in world politics today. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves and Armenia becomes an independent republic. During the Cold War, Armenia had been part of the Soviet Union. And Armenia, of course, recognizes the genocide for what it was. So April 24th is a day of remembrance in Armenia. So I don't want to frame this as a conflict with both sides. I don't want to frame this as, the Turkish government says one thing and the Armenians say another. Governments all around the world have recognized that the Armenian genocide was a genocide. And if we go through our checklist from the beginning, several of these conditions are applicable. So members of the group were killed, men and women were separated, there were conditions of life calculated to destroy the group. They were being deported into unlivable conditions, and there was also the forcible transfer of children. So it is without doubt that this genocide occurred. It is more that the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish government refuses to recognize it. So the Armenian genocide happened, and the Turkish government refuses to acknowledge it. And you may be thinking, wow, that's an injustice. But some of you may be thinking, well, why does that matter? It happened over 100 years ago. Why does it matter now? And it matters now because, this is the reason why we study genocide. Because if it goes uncommented on. It's an invitation for other people to go and repeat those same actions and repeat those same mistakes. We can see in this picture here a graveyard of genocides that happened in the 20th century, starting with Armenia, but you also have Ukraine and Nanking and the Holocaust and Cambodia and Bosnia and Rwanda and Darfur, and there's more that aren't included on here. And you can see that each of these gravestones is marked with the marker "Never Again." And the commentary here is that we keep saying "never again," and then we don't learn from our mistakes. And part of why we study atrocities like this is to try to really mean it when we say "never again." Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And so, the first step towards stopping atrocities like this from happening is to learn about them. Otherwise, they are going to happen again. And there's nothing that says that more clearly than this quote from Adolf Hitler from 1939 saying, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" The genocide of the Armenians was largely forgotten in the wake of World War I. And people like Hitler look at this and they say, well, I can do such and such thing to such and such group, and nobody's going to care because they didn't care when it happened in Armenia. They didn't care when it happened in Cambodia. They didn't care. And so I can go ahead with my plans. And that's what Hitler did. So he takes his anti-Semitic views, and as we talked about last week, and as the war goes on, that escalates, and ultimately that results in the Holocaust, in which more than 7 million people died. So we're now going to pivot from talking about Armenia to talking about the Holocaust and how that happened. So the Holocaust didn't come out of nowhere. The Holocaust had roots in long-standing anti-Semitism that was present in Germany as well as in other parts of Europe. Jews had been living in Europe for thousands of years, since the time of the Roman Empire, living in diaspora there. And during that time, anti-Semitism had grown. People viewed Jews as other, as not part of their group. Europeans were Christians, and Jews were interlopers, people who didn't belong. During the Black Death, Jews were blamed for causing it, accused of poisoning the wells. There were rumors about Jews eating Christian children or sacrificing them. They were made out to be horrible monsters or greedy manipulators. These were horrible, untrue rumors about Jews, but they were things that influenced the way that many Europeans thought about them. Anti-Semitism was common and widespread. And so when Hitler rose to power with a platform that specifically scapegoated Jews, it wasn't really that surprising. And many Jews in Germany were not that concerned to start off with. The initial anti-Semitic policies that the Nazis instated included things like boycotting Jewish businesses, encouraging people to do that, laws that restricted Jews from working in Christian universities or going to Christian schools, encouraging Jews to separate themselves from the Christian community. And these were things that Jews had seen elsewhere in Europe throughout history. So a lot of them, I mean, they weren't happy about those developments, but they weren't necessarily shocked or concerned. The concern really starts to mount with Kristallnacht, which we talked about the other day. On Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Jewish businesses all across Berlin were targeted and attacked. People on the street who were Jewish were attacked and beaten, or even people who just looked like they were Jewish were attacked and beaten. And this was a real wake-up call to a lot of Jews in Germany about the seriousness of what was going on, and how they needed to respond. This led to a huge wave of emigration out of Germany. Um, and this was actually Hitler's initial goal. Hitler's goal with what he termed the Jewish problem was that he was going to rid Germany of Jews by encouraging them to immigrate elsewhere, by making Germany as unhospitable as possible. However, there were some problems with this plan. Other countries often wouldn't take them or would only take a certain amount of them. This included allied countries like the United States and Britain. The US turned away entire ships of boats carrying Jews who were seeking refuge in the United States. Another issue was that many Jews decided to emigrate to Poland. Poland already had a really high Jewish population, and many Jews went there as um, as this emigration wave happened. And then Hitler conquered Poland. And at that point, he was governing over 3 million more Jews than he had before. So this meant that the idea of getting all of these Jews to emigrate and to leave the country was really not feasible. There was nowhere for them to go, and there were simply too many of them for that plan to work. So as he realizes that this emigration idea was not going to suffice, he turns to other solutions. One of the first things that he does after conquering Poland is to start to segregate the Jews, to separate them from the rest of society. Nazis started to force Jews to live in ghettos. These were small sections of the city that were closed off and sealed from the rest. Many Jews from the city or from the surrounding region were forcibly relocated into these ghettos. Jews were also forced to wear the Star of David to mark them out as Jews, so that everybody that they passed would know that they were Jewish, often resulting in persecution and poor treatment as a result of that. That was when ghettos were open for people to come and go. Eventually, these ghettos were closed off, and Jews were not allowed to leave at all. Ghettos in general were overcrowded, poorly supplied. Many people in them died of disease or malnutrition because they were all crowded together, which allowed more disease to take root. Others who were the main value that the Nazis found in keeping the Jews in these ghettos was using them for work in factories and things like that. And so when people grew too weak to work because of disease or an accident, many of them were killed on the spot. One of the most famous ghettos was in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. It was the largest. It saw numerous attempts of violent resurrection against the Nazi rule, although none of those attempts were actually successful. Now that they had the Jews all separated in these ghettos, the Nazis had to decide what to do with them, and that happened at a meeting known as the Wannsee Conference. This was a meeting of senior government officials from Nazi Germany, leaders of the SS, as well as major industry leaders from Germany, so people who ran railroads and factories and things like that. They met in a suburb called Wannsee, so a suburb of Berlin, on January 20th of 1942. In this meeting, they laid out the plan of how to exterminate the Jews and how that was going to happen, how the Jews were going to be transported, where they were going to go, the death camps that would be built, the methods that would be used to kill them. It was very meticulous. It was planned out. It was systematic. It was cold. There were multiple aspects of the German military and industry that were going to be a part of this effort. So this leads us to what is known as the final solution. So the final solution to what Hitler termed the Jewish problem was the extermination of the Jewish race. The first killings were carried out in the field as the Nazis advanced into new territory, especially in the east. Jews from that town that they had just taken over would be rounded up. They would take them to a remote area, force them to dig ditches, and then shoot them in the backs. After the Wannsee Conference, however, Jews started being moved into camps. There were two varieties of these camps: concentration camps and death camps. Concentration camps were work camps where the Jews were forced to work in aid of the Nazi cause. Jews in concentration camps were held with little food or supplies, and many people died from malnutrition or disease. Death camps, on the other hand, were designed to kill. The ghettos were systematically emptied out, and Jews were sent to either concentration camps or straight on to death camps. Arriving Jews at the death camps would be stripped naked and led to showers. However, these showers were not real showers. They would emit poisonous gas, killing the people who were trapped in the room. This trickery was intended to make the Jews more likely to follow the orders. They weren't meant to know that they were about to die. Once the Jews had been killed, their bodies would be stripped of any valuables, including gold teeth or jewelry or wedding rings. When these camps were liberated by the Allies, they found piles and piles of valuables that the Nazis had collected, piles of wedding rings, piles of shoes and clothing that had been taken from these bodies, that the Nazis had held onto and collected. After the bodies had been stripped, they would be cremated in large ovens or buried in large pits. Very few people survived more than a couple of weeks at a death camp. These were horrible, awful places. The end result of the Holocaust were not good. When Allies liberated the camps, the arriving soldiers found residents starving and mountains of confiscated clothes, jewelry, and shoes. As the Russians advanced to the east, the Nazis emptied out the camps and forced the Jews to march with them as they retreated. Thousands of people died on these death marches. These death marches are also proof that to the Nazis, the extermination of Jews was not a side project in this war. It was part of the point of the war. If it had been a side project, they would have left the Jews behind. It would have been easier to leave the Jews behind. but instead they were so determined to kill them, to exterminate them, that they brought them with them. The end death toll was about 6 million Jews. This was more than half the Jewish population of Europe. There were also millions of Russians, Poles, and Ukrainians who were killed in the Holocaust, as well as more than 600,000 Roma, political enemies of the Nazis, so people like communists, German communists, people with disabilities, and homosexuals were all targeted. At the end of the war, the Allies held a series of trials known as the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi officials and leaders were put on trial for their actions during the war. Nazi high officials were accused of crimes against humanity. This was the first time in history that that term was used, because under the Nazi regime, they had not committed any crimes. Their actions were made legal. I want to end on a slightly more positive note, which is Holocaust resistance. The Holocaust required the complicity and the participation of countless German soldiers and civilians, as well as people from other countries as well. But there were people who were willing to stand up to injustice, many of them risking their lives or even losing their lives in the process. So there are people like Irina Sendler, who was a Polish nurse who was responsible for smuggling over 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. In her capacity as a nurse, she had access to the ghetto to conduct sanitation inspections. And when she visited, she would conceal children in prams, in ambulances, even in suitcases to get them out. She hid these children with Polish Catholic families, giving them Christian names and false identity papers. At one point during the war, she was captured, tortured, and sentenced to execution, but other members of the organization that she worked with bribed the guards to release her. And after the war, she made efforts to reunite the children that she had smuggled out with any of their surviving family. There's also Johann van Hulst, who was a Dutch teacher who saved over 600 Jewish children from the Nazis. He disguised children in baskets and sacks and smuggled them out of Amsterdam by bicycle. Van Hulst also survived the war and later served on the Belgian Senate. There are also people like Ludwika Pukas and Johanna Eck who maybe didn't save hundreds of people, but who, on a much more personal scale, saved their friends and neighbors. So Pukas was a Ukrainian maid who sheltered her Jewish employer and her children. The mother of those children was eventually found by the Nazis, but the children lived through the war. Johanna Eck was a Berlin housewife who hid Jews in her little apartment, people who had been her friends and neighbors prior to the war. And I bring these people up because it's important for you guys to realize that people are not powerless. You are not powerless. When totalitarian governments take control, one of their powers, one of their real strengths is in convincing people that they are alone, that nobody else agrees with them, that speaking out would be suicide, and that there's nothing that they can do to stand up to this all-knowing, all-powerful regime. These people may not have been able to stop the Holocaust. 6 million people did still die, but they were able to save some, and they did make a difference. There are people alive today, descendants of the people that they saved, who would not be here if it weren't for their actions. I want you guys to remember that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And you all have power in your actions and in what you are willing to allow to happen in the world around you.